Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, we are back today on the Allender Center podcast to continue our conversation on women's sexuality. And I'm here with Cathy Loerzel and Christy Bauman for part 2 of this conversation. As you know, if you listened last week, we actually kicked Dan out because today we're going to talk about what we wish other women knew about sexuality. And let me just name a few things I think will be helpful just as we continue this conversation. One, to talk about sexuality in general is both like deeply courageous and also foolish because you're just going to step in places that a lot of people aren't comfortable with. 2, it's a really complex thing. So let us just name from the beginning. Although we are deep thinking women, although we are women, we're not in any way trying to speak universally for all women. So I just want to claim that. But my question would be for us as we kind of kick this off, we were just reflecting together before we even launched into this conversation, just how much we appreciated the podcast that the men did a few months ago on men's sexuality, because one of the things that really felt revelatory is they actually spent a lot of time talking about their fears about intimacy, relational connection, and the emotions behind sex as it's connected to bodies and stories. But that really bumped up against some myths that I think men bear about their own sexuality. And so I'm curious, what are some of the myths you think that we need to unpack for women about our sexuality?
Well, I'll jump in. I really, truly have this deep conviction that women's bodies and women's arousal cycles are the invitation to the divine. And I was never taught that growing up. I was never taught to even think about my arousal cycle growing up in the church. I remember driving home on my wedding night bawling because I was going to have sex and I was going to be less holy somehow. And so I had no idea, and I had grown up becoming more asexual in my mind and in my heart to be a better Christian. And so then all of a sudden I was supposed to know my body and understand it. And through the last decade, I have committed myself to understanding that God had an intention when he made my arousal cycle the way it is. And even though it's painstakingly sometimes long to invite it into the room, that it is the Holy of Holies. It's that invitation and that care that it takes to get to the sacred. And so I have this passion for women to know that their bodies are good and what they need, even to reach climax, is important and good to trust. It's so important and good to trust. And I just don't think we say that out loud. I think it's always the crock pot analogy. It just sounds terrible. It doesn't sound alluring to me. And yet there's something of the divine that I want to believe that God was intentional whenever he created my body and the arousal cycle and what it takes to find ecstasy, in a sense.
Yeah, I was not taught that either. Yeah, I do think it's interesting. Even before we were on the where we pushed play on the podcast, there was a sense of the myth that our bodies aren't meant for pleasure or for our own pleasure. I remember, and even now when I think about how quickly my husband can come to arousal, come to climax, I'm so frustrated by that. It feels so unfair. And I think there is an embedded risk in that, where then I go to my own self-contempt around that it takes longer for me. And for even him to then, how is he managing his frustration around my arousal cycle and whether or not I can come to climax or not, and what that takes. And, even the fact that I'm using it and saying what it takes to get there, it feels like it's something that has to be embarked upon, and it's not, and for some women that's not true. Sometimes women have a much shorter arousal span, and And that's like fabulous, but I feel like there's not a whole lot of conversation around even the difference between those. And that for some women, it can take 30 minutes. For some people, it can take 7, but that's not talked about very often in our circles, I don't think.
Right, or even pride ourselves on how fast we can get aroused or get off or whatever the feeling is. And so it's like, is that a thing to be proud of? Mm-hmm. Or what does it mean to actually be curious about what's happening in our bodies and what we're feeling and experiencing, and what is it inviting us to? Just feels like important questions that we don't discuss often. Yeah. When we're talking about that.
I think in some ways, if we're saying that sex is inherently a relational encounter, and there's, obviously there's a relationship that has to go into it. And so I think for women, when we have been so cut off from our bodies and can't, and actually may not know. I mean, I'm curious how many women listening to this, and men as well, who are like, arousal cycle, what does that mean? How often as women, I think, one of the things we were talking about is like, there aren't many spaces, especially as we are adolescents, because I do want to make sure to acknowledge, like, we are sexual beings, whether we're married or not. And so I know there are a lot of women listening to this going, well, how does this apply to me? I'm not in a marriage relationship, or I'm not allowed to talk about my sexual life because I'm not in a marriage relationship, but that's just kind of off limits. So we all just pretend like, I think that's kind of what we do. We just pretend like you just, like you magically walk through a door one day and bam, you're there. I used to joke about this in my church when I was single. People would want to talk with me about my struggles with sexuality. And I would be like, why is it assumed I have struggles with sexuality because I'm single? And like, your married sex is just awesome. Like, let's have more honest conversations. But I remember like being a teenage girl and just wishing I had someone to like talk about these things with, about our bodies, about our developing bodies. And I know some people's parents, maybe, or moms, had rituals of like blessing, becoming a woman. But I think for so many of us, a period was like such a shameful thing. And so at the very beginning of our budding and awakening, there's so much shame that comes and so much isolation in what it means for us to be sexual beings as women. Does that feel true to you guys? Is that something you would,
Very much so. I feel like isolation is such a word because it's all of a sudden you keep going inward. And so now I bleed, and then I'm not certain of what sexuality looks like. Then I'm in a relationship where there's sexuality. Then there's the potential for being with child. Then there's birth. Then there's stretch marks. Then there's low-hanging breast after breastfeeding. I just think that whole span of our bodies starting and growing up and then growing down. As we're creating, we also have a body that we either have to look at the scars and the baggage on, and how do we feel aroused, or how do we bless that? And so I just think, it's in my head. What's my weight? What's the scars that are now on my stomach because I have stretch marks? All these things. Now I'm alone, trying to either mitigate them or somehow hide them and still be what I assume has to be the sexual being, the perfect sexual being. And I can't really share that anywhere that's safe enough. I'm kind of left alone in that in my mind, and at least that's been for me a hard place. Yeah,
I think there's such setups for shame and contempt towards your own body, and I think even for that's true all through the media, all through our world, all through our culture, through spouses and relationships. Like, there's so much coming against women to be ashamed and to feel like we're broken. We're broken if we're too much. We're broken if we're not enough. We're broken if our, there's just something that I feel like evil's constantly inviting us to turn against ourselves. And what I don't see, and I think even the hope for this podcast, is a sense of how do we celebrate and bring into the world more of a sense of how remarkable a woman's body is, how remarkable our bodies are, regardless of where they are, in pregnancy or not pregnancy or never having born kids or gaining weight during college. I mean, even just the phrases like the freshman 15, like there's so much violence that's meant to keep us separated from something that's meant to be so good. And I think that's true for men as well in different ways. But, even as we're talking, I keep on thinking, like, we're not broken. It's just hardly talked about how different we are than men. And, even for what we talked about in the first podcast around the shame that comes when you don't necessarily want to have sex, or you're working out your own desire, or when your body doesn't quite come alive in the way that you would want in order to be connected with a partner. I don't know that we have a whole lot of theology or imagination for how to tend to those parts of ourselves and allow there to be a continuous awakening so that we can be in our bodies in a way that we don't feel shame, we don't feel contempt. Because I think when you're up against that, pleasure becomes very dark, if pleasure can be got to at all. Because there's almost a sense of you're wedding pleasure with a violent arousal structure that is connected together in order for you to like reach an orgasm, or even having to disconnect from your body in order to handle having sex without going into trauma. There's so much violence that's just embedded in it, and that I don't quite know how to navigate or negotiate, really, even though this is like, something I'm supposed to be very well knowledgeable about. Like, I teach on arousal structures and all of our, and people often ask, like, you talk so much about dark and violent arousal structures. Do you have a sense of what a good arousal structure is? And it's hard for me to talk about that. I have a lot of all my slide decks around violent arousal structures and how those are intended to harm you. I don't have a whole lot of slides around what healthy sexual arousal structures look like over time, and what even the hope and imagination would be for us. But I know that has to be cultivated, and I think that's part of why, Christy, I love your book, because it actually seeks to cultivate some of that on our behalf and like honor something of womanhood that is so often put in the dark, isolated, put away, and we're relegated to kind of a desert that isn't actually for our flourishing or pleasure or goodness, that I do believe there's something of God to be found in that resurrection.
And there has to be something of God to be found, because I say this, I would give it up. I would give sex up in a second for the harm it's caused, for the amount of stories or things I've seen that objectification or abuse or harm has done. I would give it up. It's not worth it. Orgasm is not worth the harm I've seen. And so if God is a good God, it has to mean more. Sex has to be a prayer. It has to have some kind of spiritual power. There has to be a way, and I talk about creating gold dust. There has to be something that is bigger than all this, because the narrative I've been given around sexuality, I get bored and defeated and exhausted thinking about trying to continue to engage in sex if it is only about getting away from the harm that it's done or objectification. It has to have a spiritual lining. It has to have something of beauty that is deeper than the harm I've known, and that's really hard to find in this day and age. It just is hard to believe.
Yeah, because I do think that's another myth that I want us to contend with. Like, the research is showing that women, because of the harm we experience, whether it's through sexual abuse, violation, or just in many ways bearing the reality of misogyny and patriarchal structures that need our bodies to bear violence, need us to be subjugated, a sense of arousal structures that are deeply shaped by violence, and therefore addictive patterns that we use to reach arousal that actually are matching the same numbers as men. And so I feel like we'd be remiss not to talk about some of the realities women are facing, especially younger women who are growing up in the internet age and the digital age, who have addictions to pornography, who need imagery, who need stories and fantasies that actually aren't what our hearts are meant for in order to actually even experience arousal. And how do you contend with that reality that I'm just thinking back to our conversation, like, we want good care, But then so many of us have stories where care has been really dangerous. And that to me is some of the insidious like wickedness of evil to like cut us off from our bodies. Because I think what you're saying, Christy, I actually believe whether you are in a sexual relationship or not, there is something about our sexuality that is meant to bear like the image of God, that is meant to be a prayer, and that is deeply connected to our capacity for hope. And where we cannot be in our bodies, in the fullness of our humanity, like there is just such fragmentation there. And I think as women, we do need to cultivate more spaces where we can come together and talk honestly about our struggles and the dynamic nature of them, the complex and wide spectrum of what it means to be a woman in this world. Like, I remember when I went to the Korean spa for the first time, and if you've never been to a spa where there is, gender specific pools and steam rooms, most people go naked. And for me, it was the first time I realized how I had never really seen the real image of a woman's body without a kind of a more pornographic remake. And that sense of like just even what we see in the media, the kind of bodies that are shown to us as like, this is a woman's body. And it was so healing for me to like see such a diverse range of bodies and to know there's something really beautiful and stunning. Also to just see women taking care of their bodies, which could be like a whole nother podcast.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember the first time when I was teaching in Certificate 1 on the U diagram, the U theory. I started, for some reason, talking about my C-section scars. Like, I've had 2 babies, and both had to come through C-section because of various complications. And when you have a scar, a C-section scar, you have a flap of skin that kind of hangs over it. And, that's just part of your new body that I had never really seen. No one had talked to me about, like, no doctor came and talked to me about, like, hey, by the way, like, we're going to cut into like 7 layers of your abdomen to get this baby out. And this is major abdominal surgery. And your scar isn't just going to go away. Like, your body is going to be forever changed by this. And I remember saying that from up front, which was shocking, one, to some men, that I was talking about, C-section scars, uteruses, which, I tend to do when I talk. But also women came up afterwards and said, thank you. Like, thank you for, I have a C-section scar too. And no matter how much weight I lose or whatever, there's always this flap. And no one has ever talked about the flap from up front. And that was a revelatory moment for me in the sense of how much we don't actually talk about the reality of our bodies. And again, the beauty of it, and that when we actually step into that, there is something of hope and something of reverence and love and capacity that's grown as we acknowledge the reality of living in our broken, beautiful, good bodies. And that, especially for a woman, that's hardly ever talked about from up front.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, we don't talk about entering the wounded places in that way. We don't talk about the scars that brought life or the scars that are on our body that we can invite ourselves first to touch and to bless and to anoint, and then we can invite the other, because there is something kind to have a lover kiss a scar. Yes. And it's so intimate, and we actually see intimacy arises in the brain at a higher level whenever we let someone enter the scarred place. And yet it's such a silent place. And I think, one, we have to do it for ourselves first. In front of a mirror, when we're getting into a bath, we have to look at our body. We have to look at the places on it that have story, and we have to name how proud or what we think of that place, and can we bless it. And then we bring the wounded places to our sisterhood or to our partners, and we ask them, will you bless these wounded places, and can I share that with you? And there is such an intimacy when those places are touched.
But just, I think, as we come to our final moments, it's like I'm just thinking back to your words around there has to be something divine in our sexuality. There has to be a prayer. And it just makes me think, I want to invite the women listening today, I want to invite myself, I want to invite all of us, no matter the circumstances we find ourselves in, to understand that sense of like, there's something so holy, so divine, so good about who we've been created to be. And that good sex is worth the risk and the invitation. That sense of like, you hear like, oh, it's all about frequency. And that's what, signifies healthy sex. And I just think if so many of us as women knew that this would be in some ways like a battleground to fight for our goodness and to fight for taking up space, and that it's okay if this isn't something we figure out how to do in a day. Like we have a kind of, as Dan used that word, like millennia, like we have a millennia of kind of stuff that's been piled on us, that's been carried down through generations to in some ways navigate. And I think I just want to speak hope and blessing to taking the risk to want to desire that and still not maybe know what to do or how to move, but to let that desire for a different kind of intimacy, a different kind of blessing, a different kind of prayer to really unfold. So any final hopes you would share with the people, the men and women listening today?
My thought was just let that be. Like, let that be, Lord, let that be true. And that we would maybe ask our sisters to join us in that, that we would be that vulnerable. I think I've even I can ask myself, and I think I've gotten to the place where I can ask my husband, but I still hesitate to ask my sisterhood, in a sense, to come and join me in those places, and I don't want to be alone in them. Mm-hmm. Where I've felt motherless or grandmotherless with someone to ask these questions to, or that I would ask my sisters to know me and be with me in that place. So.
Yeah, that brings tears to my eyes. I mean, even the idea of us sitting around and talking about this, knowing that we haven't given anyone like real solutions or a 5-step program of how you honor your sexuality. It's so much more complex than that, and you're radically walking into the realm of powerlessness and hopelessness, and the rebirth of an imagination that moves beyond anything that we're able to really grapple with, without the Spirit kind of touching down into our bodies. And I think for me to be able to connect the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, to my sexuality, and to know it's not about a self-exploration that's all of a sudden going to be, I'm going to go fix myself by reading all these books, or, going on a 7-day hike, or, whatever. I mean, whatever the fantasy is around how you can all of a sudden find your body back or something, it's not like that. And I think to invite us into a place where it's truly a spiritual practice to combat a culture that's asking you to hate and hate yourself. Like the spiritual practice is to actually come back and bless. That's radical.
That is.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Well, on that note, I'm sure there are many more conversations to be had, but we thank you for taking the risk to be with us today. And I want to thank you again, Cathy, and you again, Christy, for jumping into this pretty vulnerable and risky conversation. And we hope it bears good fruit. Until next time. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.